The mule's name was Chester, and he'd been carrying tourists and supplies down into the Grand Canyon for 9 years, without incident, when he suddenly planted his hooves and refused to move forward on the Bright Angel Trail. The wrangler, a 30-year veteran named Ray Cordova, tried the usual encouragements, gentle tugs on the lead rope, and soft words that had worked 1,000 times before, but Chester wasn't having it. The mule's ears were pinned back flat against his skull, his nostrils flared, and he kept pawing at something half buried in the trail with his right front hoof, dirt and small stones flying up with each strike. Ray dismounted from his own mule and walked back to see what had Chester so agitated. It was early April, the spring tourist season just ramping up, and the trail maintenance crew had been through here 2 days ago clearing winter debris. Whatever Chester had found shouldn't have been there. Ray knelt beside the spot where the mule was pawing and saw the edge of something metallic protruding from the soil, dull red with rust, but definitely human-made. He pulled his work gloves from his belt and carefully brushed away loose dirt, revealing a rectangular tin box about the size of a hardback book, the kind that might have held cookies or tea decades ago. The box rattled when Ray lifted it, something inside shifting and clinking against the metal walls. He should have left it alone, should have marked the spot and reported it to a ranger, but 40 years of working outdoors had made him curious about things that didn't belong, and he popped the corroded lid before better judgment could stop him. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag that had seen better days, were items that made Ray's stomach drop. A Texas driver's license with a photo of a young woman smiling at the camera, a silver bracelet engraved with initials, a small notebook with water-damaged pages, and a folded piece of paper covered in handwriting that was still mostly legible despite obvious exposure to moisture. Ray pulled out the license and read the name. Andrea Chen, born 1989, Houston address, issued 2014. The photo showed an Asian woman in her mid-20s with long dark hair and an expression that suggested she was laughing at something just off camera. Ray had been working the canyon since 2003, had seen thousands of tourists come and go, and he had a good memory for faces, but this one didn't register. He checked the date on the license again, then pulled out his phone to check if he had signal. 2 bars. Enough. He dialed the Grand Canyon National Park dispatch and reported what Chester had found, giving precise coordinates based on trail markers. The ranger, who arrived 20 minutes later, was investigator Michael Tsosi, a Navajo man in his 40s who'd been with the Park Service for 18 years and had worked more missing persons cases than he cared to count. The Grand Canyon swallowed people with depressing regularity, usually solo hikers who ignored warnings or tourists who climbed over guardrails for photos. And Tsosi had developed the kind of professional detachment that let him function without drowning in the weight of all that loss. But when Ray handed him the tin box and he saw Andrea Chen's license, something clicked in his memory. That name was familiar, not from recent cases, but from something older, something that had bothered him for years. Back at the ranger station, Tsosi pulled the case file from the archives, a thick folder that hadn't been opened in 5 years. Andrea Chen, Brandon Cole, and Melissa Ortega, 3 college friends from the University of Texas who'd come to the Grand Canyon for spring break in March 2016. They'd filed a backcountry permit for a 3-day, 2-night trip from the South Rim down to Indian Garden and back, an ambitious but manageable route for experienced hikers. They'd checked in at the Backcountry Information Center on March 14th, collected their permit, and set out down the Bright Angel Trail around noon. They were due back on March 17th by 6 p.m., and when they didn't show up, their rental car still parked at the trailhead, the Park Service had initiated a search. The search had been extensive, running for 8 days and involving over 60 personnel from multiple agencies: park rangers, county search and rescue teams, helicopter crews, technical climbers, and cadaver dogs. They'd covered the permitted route thoroughly, checking every campsite and side trail, looking for any sign of the missing hikers. They'd found nothing. No footprints beyond the first mile of trail, no discarded equipment, no clothing or personal items, no disturbance at Indian Garden, where the group should have camped. It was as though they'd vanished into thin air, somewhere between the rim and their intended destination. The investigation had considered every possibility. Maybe they'd changed their route without telling anyone, gone off trail to explore a slot canyon or a viewpoint. Maybe they'd fallen, a single misstep sending them tumbling into one of the innumerable ravines that cut through the canyon's layers. Maybe they'd gotten lost, become disoriented in terrain that looked similar from every angle, and died of exposure before searchers could find them. Or maybe something else had happened, something the evidence couldn't explain because there was no evidence. The case had stayed open technically, but after the first year with no new leads, it had gone cold. The families had hired private investigators who'd walked the same trails and asked the same questions and found the same nothing the official search had produced. Brandon Cole's parents had offered a $20,000 reward for information leading to their son's whereabouts. Melissa Ortega's sister had created a website documenting the case and soliciting tips from anyone who'd been in the canyon that March. Andrea Chen's mother had flown from Houston to Arizona 4 times in the first 2 years, walking the trails herself, calling her daughter's name into the vast indifference of the canyon. Eventually, even the most persistent family members had accepted that answers might never come. But now Tsosi was holding a tin box that Andrea Chen had presumably carried into the canyon 8 years ago, and that box contained items she would never have willingly abandoned. He photographed the license, bracelet, and notebook where they lay, then carefully removed the folded paper and spread it flat on his desk. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, written in what looked like ballpoint pen that had started to run when moisture seeped into the box despite the plastic bag protection. But most of it was readable, and what Tsosi read made him reach for his phone to call the park's chief ranger. March 15th, 2016. If someone finds this, we need help. We're stuck in a canyon off the main trail. Brandon fell yesterday afternoon, broke his leg badly. We tried to splint it, but he's in a lot of pain, and I think there might be internal bleeding. Melissa and I carried him as far as we could, but we can't get him back up to the trail. We're about 2 miles off route, east of the 3-mile rest house. There's a dry waterfall and then a drop into a box canyon. We climbed down, thinking there might be a way through, but it's a dead end. We can't climb back out with Brandon injured. We're rationing water and food. Please send help to these coordinates if our GPS was working right before the battery died. 360842N 112.1394W. Tsosi entered the coordinates into his mapping software and felt his chest tighten when he saw where they pointed. The location was indeed about 2 miles east of the Bright Angel Trail's 3-mile rest house, in an area of unmapped side canyons that branched off the main drainage like capillaries from an artery. The terrain there was classified as extremely hazardous, vertical walls of Coconino sandstone and hermit shale that created natural traps, box canyons with no exits that funneled unwary hikers into dead ends. The original search had focused on the permitted route and immediate surroundings, operating on the reasonable assumption that 3 experienced hikers wouldn't have strayed that far off trail. But apparently they had, and they'd paid for it. The chief ranger, a woman named Elizabeth Morales, who'd seen 30 years of canyon tragedies, read the note and immediately authorized a search operation for the coordinates. But she was realistic about what they'd find. 8 years in the canyon environment meant anything organic would be long gone, scattered by scavengers or decomposed to bone or buried under rockfall. Still, they had to look, had to give the families the closure they'd been waiting for, had to answer the question of what had happened, even if the answer was as grim as everyone expected. The search team assembled at dawn the next morning, 8 rangers, including Tsosi, plus 2 technical rope specialists from the county search and rescue squad. They hiked down the Bright Angel Trail to the 3-mile rest house, then turned east off trail into terrain that was immediately more difficult, picking their way across talus slopes and around massive boulders that had carved off the canyon walls millennia ago. The GPS led them to a narrow cleft in the Coconino layer, maybe 4 feet wide at its mouth, that opened into a descending slot canyon. Sosie stood at the entrance and looked at the smooth rock walls, polished by water that only flowed here during heavy rains. This was the kind of place that attracted adventurous hikers, that looked like it might lead somewhere interesting, that whispered promises of hidden views and discoveries. But it was also the kind of place that could kill you if you made one wrong decision. He gestured for the team to proceed, and they entered single file, boots scraping on sandstone, equipment clinking. The slot canyon descended steeply for about 100 yards, requiring careful scrambling in places where the rock was smooth and handholds were scarce. Then it opened into a wider chamber, maybe 30 feet across, where sunlight filtered down from far above and created a golden glow on the red rock walls. At the far end of the chamber was the dry waterfall Andrea had mentioned in her note, a 20-foot vertical drop with a pour-over lip that would be spectacular during the monsoon season, but was bone dry now. Below the waterfall, visible from the chamber's edge, was the box canyon, a space perhaps 50 feet wide and twice as long, enclosed on all sides by walls that rose 200 feet straight up. The rope specialists set up their anchor system, and the team rappelled down one by one into the box canyon. The floor was littered with rocks and debris from erosion, and in one corner, sheltered under an overhang, they found what they'd come looking for. The camp was still there, or what remained of it. 3 backpacks, their fabric rotted and torn by weather and animals, contents scattered. A makeshift shelter constructed from hiking poles and a tarp that had mostly disintegrated, and arranged in a row against the back wall of the overhang, 3 sets of remains. Sosie approached carefully, documenting everything with his camera before touching anything. The remains were in various states of preservation, bones scattered by scavengers but clearly human, still partially clothed in hiking gear that had survived better than flesh and fabric. One skeleton showed obvious trauma to the right femur, a break that had been splinted with sticks and rope in a pattern that matched emergency first aid training. Brandon Cole, almost certainly. The other 2 skeletons showed no obvious trauma, suggesting they died from exposure or dehydration, or both, sitting with their injured friend in a trap they couldn't escape. But as Sosie examined the scene more closely, he noticed details that didn't fit the simple story of 3 hikers dying from injury and exposure. The backpacks had been carefully arranged, their contents organized into piles that suggested someone had taken inventory. A second notebook, different from the one in the tin box, was wedged into a crack in the rock, protected from direct weather. And most significantly, there was evidence of multiple fires. More than 3 people trapped for a few days would have needed. Burn marks on the rock that suggested the site had been occupied for longer than the timeline Andrea's note implied. Sosie called for the medical examiner who'd have to make official identification and determination of cause of death, and for the forensic team that would document everything in exhaustive detail. Then he retrieved the second notebook and started reading. What he found was an 8-day chronicle of desperation, survival, and ultimately failure, written in 3 different handwriting styles, as Andrea, Melissa, and Brandon took turns documenting their ordeal. March 15th, Andrea. Brandon fell around 2 p.m. yesterday. We were trying to find a way down to Pipe Creek, thought we saw a route from above, scrambled down this slot canyon and found the waterfall. Brandon went first, thought he could climb down, but a handhold broke and he fell 20 feet onto rocks. His right leg is broken, compound fracture, bone came through the skin. We got it cleaned and splinted, but he's in agony. Melissa is a nursing student. She's doing what she can. We can't get him back up the waterfall. We tried for 3 hours. It's too steep, and he can't put weight on the leg. We're trapped here. We have food for maybe 4 days if we're careful. Water for 2. I'm going to try to climb out tomorrow and get help. March 16th, Melissa. Andrea tried climbing out this morning, made it about 60 feet up the north wall before the rock got too smooth. She's a good climber, but this is beyond her skill level. We need technical equipment we don't have. We tried signaling with a mirror, hoping someone on the rim might see, but we're too deep and the walls are too high. Brandon's fever is getting worse. The leg is infected. We've been giving him ibuprofen from the first aid kit, but it's not enough. He's starting to drift in and out of consciousness. We have 1 day of water left. We're going to have to ration it strictly. March 17th, Andrea. Water is gone. We've been licking moisture off the rocks in the morning when dew forms, but it's not enough. Brandon is delirious. The infection is spreading up his leg. We can see red lines running toward his hip. Melissa says that's blood poisoning, that he needs antibiotics immediately or he'll die. We don't have antibiotics. We don't have anything. I tried screaming for help until my voice gave out, but nobody heard. We're miles from anywhere people go. The Park Service will start looking for us today when we don't show up at the trailhead. But how will they find us here? We're invisible from above, off the main trail. In terrain, they'd have no reason to search. I'm leaving this notebook and my license in a tin box I had in my pack. Going to try to climb out again, maybe get it to the trail where someone might find it. If I don't make it back, at least maybe someone will eventually find the box and know to look for us. March 18th, Melissa. Andrea left yesterday at dawn. Said she'd climb until she made it out or couldn't go any farther. It's been over 24 hours and she hasn't come back. Brandon died this morning around 10 a.m. The infection got too bad and he just stopped breathing. I tried CPR, but his heart wouldn't restart. I'm alone now with his body and I don't know what to do. I don't have the strength to bury him. The ground is too hard and I don't have tools. I covered him with his sleeping bag. I don't want to die here. I'm going to try Andrea's route, see if I can make it out. If I can't, at least I'll die trying instead of sitting here waiting. The entries ended there. Sosie read them twice, feeling the weight of what these 3 people had gone through, the fear and pain and desperate hope that someone would find them in time. Then he looked at the 3 sets of remains and understood that Andrea had made it farther than Melissa, had succeeded in getting the tin box to the Bright Angel Trail before whatever happened to her happened, but hadn't made it all the way out. The trail maintenance crew had been through countless times over 8 years. Mules had walked past that spot thousands of times, and only now, only because Chester had been in the exact right place at the exact right moment and had decided to paw at something that didn't smell right, had the box been found. The forensic team arrived and began their systematic documentation. They photographed the scene from every angle, collected bone samples for DNA analysis, bagged and tagged every item of potential evidence. The medical examiner conducted a preliminary examination and confirmed 3 separate individuals, trauma patterns consistent with the story in the notebooks. Official identification would require DNA comparison with family samples, but the circumstances and personal effects made it virtually certain these were the missing University of Texas students. The question was what happened to Andrea after she left the box canyon. She'd made it to the Bright Angel Trail, had buried the tin box near the 3-mile rest house, but she hadn't climbed back down to her friends, and she hadn't made it out to safety. Sosie organized a secondary search, focusing on the area between the box canyon and where the tin box was found. If Andrea had been severely dehydrated and exhausted from climbing, she might have collapsed somewhere along that route, and her remains would be somewhere in that 2-mile span of brutal terrain. The team spread out in a line and began working their way slowly across the landscape, eyes scanning every crevice and shadow. The search took 3 days, made difficult by the same terrain that had trapped the original 3 hikers, steep slopes and hidden drops, and thousands of places where a body could lie concealed. But on the afternoon of the 3rd day, a ranger named Jessica Ruiz found bones wedged in a narrow crack at the base of a cliff, hidden under an overhang that made them invisible except from one specific angle. The remains were skeletal, scattered by scavengers, but enough was present to confirm human origin. Personal effects nearby included the shredded remains of a backpack, a broken hiking boot, and most significantly, a student ID card from the University of Texas with Andrea Chen's name and photo. She'd made it within half a mile of the Bright Angel Trail, had been so close to safety that she might have been able to see the trail from where she fell. But something had gone wrong in those final moments. Maybe she'd been too dehydrated to think clearly and had taken a wrong step. Maybe the climb had exhausted her and she'd simply collapsed. Maybe she'd fallen during the night, trying to navigate by moonlight. The exact cause would never be known, but the outcome was clear. The medical examiner conducted examinations on all 4 sets of remains and confirmed identity through DNA analysis, comparing samples to family members. Brandon Cole was identified through his parents' DNA, Melissa Ortega through her sister's, Andrea Chen through her mother's. The official cause of death for Brandon was listed as sepsis secondary to compound fracture and bacterial infection. Melissa and Andrea both died from dehydration and exposure, their bodies simply giving out after days without water in the harsh canyon environment. The families were notified before any public announcement was made. Sozi made the calls personally, believing he owed them that after 8 years of waiting. Brandon's parents cried and thanked him and asked if their son had suffered. Sozi said honestly that yes, he had, but that his friends had stayed with him until the end. Melissa's sister asked if they'd tried to save themselves, and Sozi said yes. They'd tried everything. They'd fought hard and done everything right, except make the initial decision to leave the trail. Andrea's mother asked if her daughter had made it far, if she'd gotten close to help, and Sozi said yes, she'd made it incredibly far, had shown remarkable strength and determination, had succeeded in leaving evidence that would eventually bring them all home. If you're listening to this story, and you understand why these families needed answers, even 8 years later, even when those answers brought pain along with closure, maybe you'll consider subscribing, because the wilderness holds thousands of stories like this one, and telling them matters not just to honor the lost, but to prevent others from making the same mistakes. The story broke nationally within 24 hours of the official announcement, and the response was overwhelming. News outlets ran features on the 3 students, pulling photos from their social media accounts, showing them smiling at graduation, on previous hiking trips, at concerts and parties, living normal lives that had been cut suddenly and tragically short. The University of Texas held a memorial service that was attended by hundreds of students and faculty, many of whom had never known the 3 personally, but were moved by the story of young people dying so far from home. The online response was more complicated. Amateur sleuths dissected every detail of the case, questioning why the students had gone off trail, why they hadn't turned back when the terrain got difficult, why Andrea hadn't stayed with her friends instead of leaving them. The criticism was sometimes valid and sometimes vicious. Armchair experts with no wilderness experience passing judgment on decisions made in extremis by people facing circumstances they'd never encounter. Sozi tried to ignore it, but occasionally he'd read something particularly egregious and have to resist the urge to respond, to explain that hindsight was perfect, but being trapped in a box canyon with a dying friend wasn't. The Park Service conducted a formal review of the original search operation, trying to determine if anything could have been done differently. The conclusion was that the search had been appropriate, given the information available at the time. The students had filed a permit for a specific route, and search protocols reasonably focused on that route and nearby areas. The location where they actually died was far enough off the planned path that searching it would have required assuming the group had made decisions that seemed unlikely for experienced hikers. In retrospect, those decisions had been made, but searching every possible deviation from a filed plan would have required resources the Park Service simply didn't have. Still, the case prompted changes in how the Grand Canyon handled backcountry permits and search operations. The Park Service implemented new requirements for permit holders to check in at designated waypoints via satellite messenger, devices that could transmit GPS coordinates even when cell coverage was non-existent. The program was optional initially, but it became mandatory for solo hikers and groups attempting difficult or technical routes. The devices had existed during the 2016 disappearance, but they hadn't been required, and the 3 students hadn't carried one. The Park Service also updated its trail signage, adding warnings at specific locations where hikers were known to leave the main trail. The sign erected near the 3 Mile rest house where Andrea had left the tin box was particularly blunt. Off-trail travel is extremely dangerous. Terrain beyond this point contains deadly hazards, including box canyons and cliff drop-offs. Multiple fatalities have occurred. Stay on marked trails. Some hikers appreciated the directness. Others complained it was alarmist, but the signs stayed up. And search and rescue statistics suggested they had an effect, with off-trail incidents declining by about 15% in the 2 years following implementation. Brandon Cole's parents established a scholarship fund at the University of Texas for students studying wilderness emergency medicine, a field Brandon had been interested in. They reasoned that if more people knew how to handle medical emergencies in remote locations, maybe fewer would end in tragedy. The scholarship paid for training courses, equipment and research projects, and over the next decade it trained hundreds of students who went on to work in search and rescue, wildland medicine, and Park Service emergency response. Melissa Ortega's family donated money to the Arizona Search and Rescue Association, funding equipment upgrades and training programs. They were particularly interested in supporting technology that could help locate missing hikers faster, thermal imaging systems for helicopters, and improved GPS tracking protocols. They couldn't bring Melissa back, but they could help prevent other families from going through what they'd endured. Andrea Chen's mother, a woman named Susan, who'd emigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s and built a successful accounting practice in Houston, took a different approach. She learned technical rock climbing at age 58, despite having no previous experience, and spent the next 3 years training until she was competent enough to make the climbs her daughter had attempted. Then she hired a guide and went down into the box canyon where Andrea had died, rappelling down the dry waterfall and standing in the space where her daughter had spent her last days. Susan didn't publicize what she did there, refused all interview requests, and never spoke publicly about the experience. But people who knew her said she came back different, more at peace somehow, as though physically occupying that space and surviving the descent Andrea hadn't survived had closed some circuit in her grief. She continued to hike in the Grand Canyon every year on the anniversary of Andrea's disappearance, always going down the Bright Angel Trail to the 3 Mile rest house, always stopping at the spot where Chester had kicked up the tin box, always leaving flowers there before turning back toward the rim. The 3 students were buried in their home states in services that drew hundreds of mourners. Brandon's funeral in Dallas was attended by his entire high school graduating class. Young adults, now who'd known him as a funny kid who loved camping and terrible puns. Melissa's service in San Antonio featured music she'd loved, indie rock bands and folk singers, and her sister gave a eulogy that focused on Melissa's compassion and her commitment to nursing, to helping people who needed care. Andrea's funeral in Houston was smaller, her family being intensely private, but her mother had arranged for a slideshow of photos that showed Andrea growing up, toddler to teenager to college student, and the last photo was one taken at the Grand Canyon during a previous trip, Andrea standing at a viewpoint with her arms spread wide and the vast canyon behind her, expressions suggesting joy at being exactly where she was. Ray Cordova, the mule wrangler whose animal had found the tin box, was invited to all 3 funerals, but attended none. He was uncomfortable with the attention, didn't feel he'd done anything worth recognition, thought the families deserved their privacy without a stranger who'd simply been in the right place at the right time. But he did write letters to each family, explaining exactly how Chester had found the box, describing the mule's behavior and the exact circumstances, because he thought they deserved to know those details even if they seemed insignificant. All three families wrote back thanking him, and Melissa's sister said the letter had made her cry because even though it couldn't bring her sister back, knowing the exact sequence of events that led to discovery somehow mattered. Chester the mule continued working the trail for another 6 years before being retired to a sanctuary for former Park Service animals. Ray visited him occasionally, bringing apples and carrots, and would sometimes talk to the mule about that day, about how if Chester had been 10 feet farther along the trail or had been in a less stubborn mood, the tin box might still be buried and the families might still be waiting for answers. "Did you know what you were doing?" Ray would ask, but Chester would just crunch his carrots and flick his ears, inscrutable as all mules were. The investigation into how the students came to be off-trail in the first place revealed a common pattern in canyon accidents. Brandon Cole had been interested in canyoneering, had watched videos online of people exploring technical slot canyons, and had become convinced he could find routes through the Grand Canyon that weren't on any maps. His Instagram account from early 2016 showed posts about finding secret places and going where nobody else goes, the kind of adventurous spirit that was admirable in appropriate contexts, but deadly when applied to terrain as unforgiving as the Grand Canyon. The group's plan had apparently been to hike down toward Pipe Creek, an area that was visible from the south rim but difficult to access, and find a route through that would bring them to the Colorado River. It was an ambitious idea that might have been feasible for a team with technical climbing gear, proper training, and multiple days of supplies. But 3 college students on spring break with standard hiking equipment had no business attempting it, and the Park Service had no record of them mentioning any deviation from their permitted route when they'd filed their paperwork. That raised questions about permit compliance and enforcement. Should the Park Service have questioned their fitness for the route they filed? Should there have been more stringent requirements for proving backcountry experience before permits were issued? The debate played out in Park Service meetings, outdoor recreation forums, and congressional hearings about public land management. Some argued for stricter regulations, mandatory training certifications, and more aggressive enforcement of route compliance. Others argued that over-regulation would destroy the sense of freedom and adventure that made wilderness areas valuable, that people had to be allowed to take risks, even if those risks sometimes resulted in tragedy. The Park Service ultimately implemented modest changes, requiring backcountry permit applicants to watch a safety video and pass a short quiz demonstrating basic knowledge of Grand Canyon hazards. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small barrier that might make some percentage of unprepared hikers reconsider their plans. Critics said it was security theater that wouldn't prevent determined people from doing stupid things, and they were probably right, but at least it meant nobody could later claim they hadn't been warned. Michael Tsosi carried the case with him long after the official investigation closed. He'd worked dozens of missing persons searches over his career, had found some people alive and some dead, and some not at all. But there was something about this one that stayed with him. Maybe it was Andrea's determination to leave evidence, to make sure someone would eventually know what happened. Maybe it was the cruel proximity, how she'd made it so close to the trail before her body gave out. Maybe it was just the waste of it. 3 intelligent, capable young people dying because of a series of small decisions that seemed reasonable in the moment but compounded into catastrophe. He started volunteering with search and rescue groups outside his Park Service duties, becoming an instructor who trained new SAR personnel in canyon rescue techniques. He emphasized the importance of thinking like the missing person, understanding their goals and capabilities, imagining what decisions they might make when things went wrong. The Chen Cole Ortega case became a teaching example, a study in how people could end up in places search teams wouldn't think to look, and how sometimes finding answers required abandoning assumptions about what rational people would do. On the 10th anniversary of the student's disappearance, Tsosi hiked down to the Box Canyon with a small memorial plaque that the families had commissioned. Getting it there required the same technical rope work the recovery operation had needed, and he brought along 2 rangers from the technical rescue team to assist. They bolted the plaque to the rock wall at the back of the canyon, in the sheltered spot where the 3 friends had spent their last days. The inscription was simple: in memory of Andrea Chen, Brandon Cole, and Melissa Ortega. They lived with courage and friendship. March 2016. The plaque was technically against Park Service regulations about installing permanent fixtures in wilderness areas, but Tsosi had gotten special permission from the chief ranger, who'd agreed that some rules could be bent for good reason. The spot was remote enough that it would rarely be seen, accessible only to technical climbers and SR personnel, but it would be there. That mattered to the families. It mattered to Tsosi. It was a marker that said these people had existed, had mattered, had died here in a place that would otherwise show no sign of their passage. The notebook Andrea had left in the Box Canyon, the one with 8 days of chronicled desperation, was eventually returned to her mother after being processed as evidence. Susan Chen kept it in a safety deposit box at her bank, too painful to read regularly, but too important to discard. She'd read it once, sitting in the bank's customer room with the vault door open behind her, and she'd wept for her daughter's fear and determination. But she'd also felt pride, that Andrea had stayed with her friends instead of saving herself, that she'd tried everything possible before accepting defeat, that she'd left a record for someone to find. If people years from now find this story and wonder why we tell it in such detail, why we document every painful decision and desperate attempt at survival, it's because these stories are how we remember the cost of taking wilderness lightly, how we honor the people who died teaching lessons the rest of us got to learn safely. If that matters to you, if you think these stories should be preserved and shared, turn on those notifications, because there are hundreds of other cases out there waiting to be told, and every one of them carries lessons that could save someone's life. The Grand Canyon itself was indifferent to all of this, of course. It continued its geological work, eroding microscopically every day, shedding rock and slowly deepening its cuts through layer after layer of stone that told stories older than human language. People kept coming by the millions, kept taking photos and exclaiming over the views, kept occasionally making bad decisions that cost them everything. The canyon didn't care. It wasn't malevolent, wasn't trying to hurt anyone, was simply a landscape that operated according to physical laws that didn't account for human fragility. But the humans who worked there, the rangers and wranglers and guides who spent their lives in proximity to that vast indifference, they cared. They carried the stories of people who died, used those stories to inform their work, told them to visitors who would listen in hopes that maybe one person would hear and make a different decision and not become the next tragedy. It was a kind of memorial service that never ended, a continual honoring of the dead through attempts to prevent more death. Chester the mule died in his sleep at age 22, old for a mule, but not unusually so, and Ray Cordova was with him at the sanctuary when it happened. Ray stood there afterward, hand on Chester's still warm neck, thinking about all the trips they'd made together, all the supplies hauled and tourists carried, and that one time a stubborn refusal to move forward had changed everything for 3 families. "Good boy," Ray said quietly. "You did good work." And then he called Michael Tsosi to let him know, because Tsosi had asked to be notified, and the ranger drove 4 hours to attend a small gathering at the sanctuary where a dozen people who'd worked with Chester told stories about the mule's stubbornness and reliability and that one extraordinary day. Susan Chen learned about Chester's death through the network of families who'd stayed connected to the case, and she sent flowers to the sanctuary with a card that read, Thank you for bringing my daughter home." The sanctuary staff didn't quite know what to do with flowers for a dead mule, but they put them in the pasture where Chester was buried, and they sent Susan a photo. She framed it and hung it in her office, a picture of a simple grave marker with flowers resting against it. And when clients asked about it, she'd say it was complicated but important, and leave it at that. The case officially closed 12 years after the initial disappearance, all available evidence processed, all investigative questions answered as completely as they could be. The file was thick, hundreds of pages of reports and photographs and witness statements, and it went into the Park Service archives where it would be preserved indefinitely. Researchers studying wilderness accidents could request access to it, and occasionally someone would, usually graduate students in recreation management or emergency medicine who were analyzing patterns in canyon fatalities. One such researcher, a doctoral candidate named Patricia Moreno, did an extensive analysis of Grand Canyon disappearances and deaths over a 50-year period, and the Chen-Cole-Ortega case featured prominently in her findings. Her research showed that off-trail hiking was involved in a disproportionate number of fatalities, that medical emergencies in remote locations had an extremely high mortality rate, and that groups were more likely to take risks than solo hikers because of social dynamics that made it hard to be the person who said we should turn back. Her dissertation became the basis for new training protocols adopted by multiple national parks, and she credited the 3 students' case as one of the key examples that informed her understanding of how wilderness accidents unfolded. Brandon Cole's younger brother, who'd been 16 when Brandon disappeared and was now in his 30s with kids of his own, started taking his family camping every summer in various national parks. He'd teach his children the lessons his brother's death had taught him about staying on trails and filing accurate permits, and knowing when to turn back. His oldest daughter asked once if he was sad that Uncle Brandon had died, and he said yes every day, but that he was also grateful for the reminder to be careful, to take nature seriously, to understand that adventure and recklessness weren't the same thing. Melissa Ortega's sister became a nurse, following the path Melissa had been on when she died. She specialized in emergency medicine and spent 10 years working in a trauma center before transitioning to teaching nursing students about crisis response and triage. She'd sometimes tell her students about her sister, about how Melissa had tried to save Brandon with limited supplies and no backup, about how training mattered, but so did judgment, about knowing when a situation was beyond your ability to fix and you needed to get help, even if that meant leaving someone behind. It was a hard lesson, and some students pushed back, but she insisted they understand it, because someday they might face that exact choice. Andrea Chen's mother continued hiking the Grand Canyon until she was 70, finally stopping only when arthritis made the steep trails too painful. She'd trained dozens of women in her Houston hiking group in technical climbing and wilderness safety, using her own story as motivation. She'd say, "I didn't know how to do any of this until my daughter died, and I learned because I needed to understand what she went through, and now I'm teaching you so maybe your kids won't have to learn the same way." The group became known in local outdoor recreation circles, women of various ages and backgrounds who'd learned to climb and navigate and handle emergencies, and several of them went on to become SAR volunteers themselves. The tin box that started everything was eventually donated to a museum of Grand Canyon history, where it sat in a display case alongside other artifacts from the park's past. The accompanying placard told the story simply and factually, explaining how the box had been buried near the trail for 8 years before a mule discovered it, and how its contents led to the recovery of 3 missing hikers. Visitors would pause at the display, read the story, and move on, and most would forget it within a week. But some would remember, would think about it the next time they planned a hike, would make different choices because of a story about 3 people they'd never met who died in a canyon that swallowed mistakes without mercy. And maybe that was enough, Tsosi thought, when he visited the museum and saw the display. He'd retired from the Park Service at 60 after 30 years of searching for people in the wilderness, and he'd moved to Flagstaff, where he consulted on SAR operations and taught wilderness medicine. He'd found hundreds of people over his career, maybe saved dozens of lives through quick response or good decisions or just being in the right place. But the ones that stayed with him were the ones like Andrea and Brandon and Melissa, the ones he'd found too late, the ones who taught lessons through their absence. On the 20th anniversary of their disappearance, Tsosi organized a memorial hike, inviting anyone who'd worked the case or been touched by the story. About 30 people showed up, including Ray Cordova, now in his 70s and moving slowly but determined to make the walk, and Susan Chen, 80 years old and using hiking poles but refusing to be left behind. They hiked down the Bright Angel Trail to the 3-mile rest house, stopping at the spot where Chester had found the tin box, and they held a brief ceremony where people shared memories and reflections. Ray talked about Chester and about how animals sometimes knew things humans didn't, how they could sense wrongness in the world and respond to it even if they couldn't explain why. Susan talked about how the canyon had taken her daughter, but also given her a community of people who cared about wilderness safety and about making sure tragedies meant something. Tsosi talked about the importance of telling these stories completely and honestly, without sugarcoating the decisions that led to death or pretending the outcomes were anything other than what they were. And then they hiked back up in silence, each person alone with their thoughts. And at the rim they went their separate ways. But they'd gathered, they'd remembered, they'd said these people mattered, and their story matters, and we won't let them be forgotten. That was what the living could do for the dead. It wasn't resurrection, it wasn't justice, but it was witness, and witness mattered. The Grand Canyon continues to draw millions of visitors every year, and most of them have wonderful experiences, safe adventures that become cherished memories. But the wilderness still takes people occasionally, still extracts its price from those who underestimate or misjudge, or just get unlucky. And when that happens, there are people like Tsosi and Ray and Susan and hundreds of others who respond, who search, who investigate, who tell the stories that emerge from tragedy, not because it undoes anything, not because it brings anyone back, but because every story carries lessons, and every lesson learned might prevent the next death. And that's the best redemption available in a world where the wilderness doesn't care about human wishes or hopes or plans. If you've followed this story from beginning to end, through all its difficult revelations and painful details, through the investigation and the aftermath and the long work of making meaning from loss, then you understand something important about why we document these cases so thoroughly. They're not mysteries for entertainment. They're real people who made real mistakes and paid real prices, and their stories deserve to be told with honesty and respect. If you believe that matters, if you think these narratives should be preserved and shared so others can learn from them, then maybe that subscribe button makes sense, because there are more stories out there, more families waiting for answers, more lessons written in the landscape for anyone willing to read them. The wilderness keeps its secrets until it doesn't, and when it finally speaks, someone needs to be listening. Someone needs to do the work of translation from evidence to understanding to story. That's the work. That's what matters. And that's why we keep telling these stories, even the ones that hurt, even the ones without happy endings, even the ones that took 8 years and a stubborn mule to break open, because truth matters. Memory matters. And the people we lose deserve to have their stories told completely, honestly, and with the respect that comes from understanding that it could have been any of us who made those same decisions and ended up in that same box canyon, waiting for help that would come too late or not at all.